Coming to tonight's session on a practical guide to adapt product thinking as a habit. Let me give an introduction to our acclaimed and admired speaker of tonight, Saurabh Pareek. Saurabh is a young professional and an entrepreneur with extensive experience in product management, business strategy, and growth. He has been part of startups, multinational corporations, as well as non-profit sectors in domains including payments, e-commerce, edtech, media, data privacy, and content management space, where he has led teams to build products and great impact and challenge the status quo. He's a strongly purpose-driven PM and deep believer that access to the best financial services, education, and healthcare are basic rights, and we as product innovators are responsible to build products that are easily accessible, simple, cost-effective, and non-discriminatory. Currently, Saurabh leads financial services products for 300 million plus customers across 200 plus markets at global payments leader, PayPal, based in Bay Area, California. In the past, he was part of the initial product team at one of India's most known startups, Paytm, during an early growth year journey of 10 million to 200 million plus customers. A very warm welcome to you, Saurabh. We are thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Handing the session over to you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Shama, for the introduction. Okay, let's get started. I think all of us had too many video calls probably in the last 1.5 years, but let's do one more. How many of you are doing something else, like cleaning dishes, playing with your kids, or something else? Just curious if you want to just post in the chat. I'm also posting some questions just so that we get started in the chat if you want to start answering. I'll start sharing my screen. Give me a second quickly. Okay, let's get started. So I think what we are going to discuss is probably, I would say, not just a speaker series per se, but keep it like a discussion, because all of us are either PMs or want to be PMs or are working with PMs in some senses. So at any point of time, if you have any questions, any comments, post it or just unmute yourself and ask so that we can keep the discussion really open. As you get started into it, I already posted a couple of points you can share in the chat so that everyone gets to know who all are there and what kind of questions, discussions we can really have. To get started, I'll introduce myself first. My name is Saurabh. Like Shama mentioned, I work at PayPal right now and been into fintech and edtech for the last few years. I, like probably many of you, did my engineering. I worked in startups, had my startup. And I think if two things I would recommend you to take away from my introduction in that sense would be just two things. One is I keep one simple goal every year, that I would have to learn something new every year, whether that is about public policy or law or management or analytics or finance. And I try to do that every year just because that is probably the only way for us to learn, because we cannot really learn everything suddenly with a short amount of time. And second, specifically on really experiment, because the more number of things you are able to try, the better understanding you will have, one, whether you even want to be a product manager and remain one, and which area really appeals to you personally, like something that aligns with what you deeply care about. As we discuss, if you are able to have a pen and paper, the goal, as we discuss, is for all of us to apply some basic principles to our thinking models. The goal is not to learn some framework or some tool which magically will help you crack interview or will become a PM, but the goal simply is use the thinking process, that whether it's your PM job task or whether it's anything else you are doing, you would be able to apply those principles. So as we go through it, we'll choose a problem statement. You start applying some of those principles. I cannot give a cool course like Shama and their team have, but I love books and I feel I've learned a lot from these 4 books. So some of you who would send your one pager, I'll dispatch you these books to 4 of you. And the goal of that is not to see whose quantity is higher. The goal is to see whose quality is there and who has been able to apply the thinking framework rather than just the amount of content or amount of information which is there. So as you get ahead in the session and start specking some of those details out. At the end of the session, probably just post it in the chat or just send me an email and I'll be happy to send you your copy of book. And if you have read any of these books, let me know already in advance. I'll make sure I'll send you something else. Okay, to get started, these are some of the questions if you're an existing PM or you aspire to be a PM, you have in some forms. It can be about anything related to, hey, I don't know if I want to be a PM, but all my friends are trying to be, should I become one? Or do I need an MBA? Or do I need to be an engineer? Or should I, read this book to crack an interview? Or should I make my resume look like this to be selected? And these are valid questions, but I think what is underlying in all of these is all of these sometimes solve a small part of the broader problem statement, because the moment you try to narrow it down to a small scenario, the problem is you would only be optimizing for that. For example, if you are applying for PM roles and you only optimize for cracking the interview, you probably will be able to crack the interview, but that doesn't mean that was the right decision for you to become a PM. Or you go for an MBA because you want to be a PM, or you decide to read a book and you think that would help you considerably. So none of those one actions will really add value. And why we are discussing this is specifically that irrespective you're PM or not, there are some habits you can build which will help you agnostically. So we'll try to focus on that. And if you have insights, how you have approached your PM journey, definitely keep sharing about that. So in next 50 minutes or so, thanks to 2 minutes I lost, we covered on introduction. We'll talk about why building habits matter. Like, why really even try to do that? Why can you not keep doing things differently every month? Then we'll quickly talk about what product thinking really is, considering so many buzzwords we have around. Is it something you should really care about if you are an aspiring or a current PM? And third is most important part, that how do you scale your career with right habits? Because no one will take control of your career. You need to. So we'll focus a lot on that area, followed by questions and answers where we can discuss the example we would have done on that one pager, as well as any other questions I can share or help from my experience as a PM. Okay, so getting started with why habits really matter. And one of the things as we get into it is, don't think about habit as a PM. Think about habit as an individual. Your habit may be going for a walk daily. It may be eating healthy every day. It may be playing with your kids every day. And all those habits give you a lot of value or satisfaction or growth in some or the other form in long run. A lot of those would not have returns in short run. So let's touch a bit on that. Now, one of the things, as you're sharing about yourself in your chats, you would see that you may be at a very different career trajectory right now. Some of you may be aspiring to be PMs and maybe fresh graduates. Some of you may be in other domain and trying to become a PM. Some of you may be in a startup and working as a PM where there may be slightly more chaos. Some of you may be at a slightly higher, level, being PM for 4-5 years, and some of you may be at 10 plus years managing multiple products at a multinational corporation, and your roles would be considerably different. There would be commonalities, but I cannot put everyone in same buckets. And I think that's where the part becomes really important. That wherever you are in your career trajectory or wherever you are in your aspirations, you really need to be able to define what your objective and learning plan is to reach your goal. So for example, if you are aspiring PM and you want to be a PM, let's say working into, I don't know, self-driving cars, then what is your really path to go there? And that is where learning plan comes into picture. Now, we generally hear learning plan as a word when we work as a product manager, but the whole reason to start with that is it really applies to our decision making as a capability. So even when you're planning your career, try to have a learning plan that how would you reach from point A to point B and what all is really needed in that journey. That would actually help you objectify and measure if you are able to achieve those things. Now, a lot of things would change based on company size in terms of skills you would develop, in terms of your focus areas. So all those factors taking into account, you should be able to define how do you reach from point A to point B. Now, for folks who have already read Atomic Habits, I think this is probably one of the most important takeaways I had, that habits are compound interest of self-improvement. And compound interest is simple. It is about being able to do something repeatedly to really get higher return. Think of it like when you invest in mutual funds and you do not take out the principal and you keep reinvesting that. Though you may not get a high return in 1 year, 2 years, but over a period of time, when you keep going for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, you would always see that your returns would be higher. And the factor that is playing role is compounding. And same really applies in your habits as you build. And think about any habit, whether PM or non-PM, you would realize that all of those habits, especially when they are good habits, they will compound a lot. Now, one thing I really want to touch on is about being a PM versus being a great PM. And of course, there would be a lot of traits which will define whether you are a great PM for your company or not. But it becomes even trickier when you think about the next role, for example, being a PM leader. And that is where it becomes even more challenging, because the skills that helped you become a PM or grow early in your PM career, for example, from being a associate product manager to, let's say, senior product manager, and you got 3 promotions in last 5 years, those are not the skills that will actually help you become a head of product or a CPO or a director of product or anything where you are managing multiple things and not executing. Because a lot of things in early in the career would heavily incline towards how great of an executor you are. But as you move up, your skills of execution would be there, but your focus would start shifting towards how you are able to think ahead, not just execute in the short term. And that's where things start getting harder. And that's where you cannot have first order thinking. And we'll talk about what first order thinking and second order thinking is for those who may not be aware. But that's where you need to start thinking that a lot of times in your early in your career, you can survive with first order thinking. But as you grow, uh, it may not be something that would take you there. And that is where it becomes important that you do not become a PM manager, but you are able to be leader, because you cannot call yourself leader. Someone else has to believe that you are good enough to be called a leader. Your designation will not do that justice to you. So how do you really make sure you're able to acquire those skills? Other point I'll tackle, and I think this graph probably many of you would have seen, again, an example of compounding interest, of just doing 1% better every day. And now that doesn't mean you have to really become 1% better every day. It really means if you're doing something as a habit over years, you would start seeing a strong compounding effect over there. Now, one of the essence over here is also that what we started with, that you should not try to prepare yourself for an interview, whether you are new hire or you are applying for lateral roles. The problem with interviews is there can be people who are great at interviews but may not turn out to be great PMs, because you still need to see a lot of cultural fitments, a lot of behavioral traits, and so on. So don't try too hard for interviews for that Google or Facebook or PayPal or Microsoft or Uber interviews, but try to really find what do you need to be good at that interview. Because you would realize eventually in few years that a lot of interviews as you get senior would not be interviews. They would be discussions which can actually happen in a coffee shop, and no one would try to schedule 5 rounds, 7 rounds of interviews with them. And that's where you'll realize that the interviews are not as structured as you grow in your career. They become more conversational, and you cannot hide behind a painted mask after that. So my recommendation is always that irrespective of the level you are, you should prepare for interviews, but you should not have an aim to crack an interview, but really let your habits be visible to people, your traits be visible to people, and let them hire you. Now, as we have talked about why thinking or why habit in terms of building right behaviors matter, let's really talk about what product thinking is. And especially with so many, I would say, buzzwords we have around how product managers should be or how they could be, I would say if you have to focus on one principal trait other than being analytical and being good at execution, you should try to build a good sense, a product sense in that sense. Now, what product sense really is, it's pretty simple. It is a skill for you to be able to understand the customer. And that should be your core competency, that you know who your customer are, you know your market, and you are able to basically solve that problem, which would make your product successful as well as customers will love. The moment you are able to ground yourself to these three traits, to be able to understand the customer, to be able to uh, identify what would make customers love your product, and identify business opportunities from there, that is all you need to focus on, instead of so much noise which would keep going around you, because you may be able to execute something, but if you're not grounded on what truly the ask was, it may become harder. Now, as we discuss this, if you have access to the chat, maybe start also sharing about, have you really ever done a customer interview or a customer discussion? It does not need to be really formal, where you really inviting someone and chatting, but surely in terms of, if you are working in, let's say, hyperlocal space, do you go and talk to 10 shopkeepers or kirana stores every month? If you're working for, let's say, a mobility company like Ola or Uber, do you really talk to your drivers or your customers every week? Or it can be, if you work in any other industry, it may apply to you in different way. But the goal over here is just to see that you don't end up focusing too much on the features, that, hey, just because my competitor launched SOS button, I should also launch SOS button. That should not be your motivation. Your motivation should be that I spoke to my customers, they have a problem about safety, and something like an SOS button will help them. And you know why they need an SOS button, how they will discover the SOS button, and how they will press it. And that's where you start with user first, really, to define the problems, that what problems do they have. Okay, they have a problem that when they are in a taxi, they don't feel comfortable sometimes based on the driver's behavior. Okay, what is my target audience? My target audience is people who are traveling late at night. My target audience can be people under 18, kids who are commuting alone, and parents are worried. It can be women traveling alone from their workspace late in the evening. uh, Once you are able to define your target audience, you are able to move forward. Okay, what my vision is really, and then you basically go down. Don't start from features, because the moment you decide that, hey, oh, my CEO told me that we need an SOS button, so let's get an SOS button done, that's where the problem happens, and that's where the feature is bound to fail in some senses. It may still be used if people need it, but it would not be a feature that customers would actually end up learning. So in summary, irrespective of domain you work on, try to identify who your customer is and what problem you are solving, and then apply all those principles on strategy as well as features and design and language and colors and so on. Now, as we get into some of the details after deciding some of those things, is as a PM, you should 100% be aware of what product success would mean. Now, let's take an example of the SOS button. Uh, Now your CEO came to you and told that, hey, put that SOS button because I just saw, our competitor launched it, and you went ahead and launched it. It is not a bad thing. Sometimes you really need to understand product manager is not the CEO of product. Uh, I would mostly compare it to be a general manager, where you should be okay to go with the gut feeling of the founder or your head of product also. But the point is your ability to rationalize that decision, that why they made that decision, because they are also vulnerable to make the same mistake. And as a PM, as an employee of that company, you also have the equal rights to really question that decision, and not to just question, but really to apply the reasoning of why it probably would not be a bad decision. And in my experience, none of those founders of head of products would really get pissed off about the fact that you asked the right question. So I would just say be vocal in those things, and be vocal in identifying what product success would mean. Now, the product success can be user growth, that you, let's say a feature was expected to grow your user base and make new users download the app. For some, it may be engagement. For some, it may be safety. For some, it may be data privacy. But you need to be clear in saying that my product would be successful if I am able to have existing users adopt my product from current 16.5% to 17.8%, and you are expecting 1.3% of increase. It can be that oh, I'm running a referral campaign. I'm expecting to acquire 1 million users over 1 year. So it can be anything, but you need to be really clear and objective when it comes to your business goals or your customer goals. And that's where the simple separation comes, that are you defining the outcomes or you are defining the output? Because the moment you would focus on the output, the challenge would be it may become slightly hard for you to say that whether the product was successful or not. Uh, but the moment you are focused on outcomes, you would be able to clearly articulate why you did it and why you should continue building it or you should deprecate a feature. So I think all those decisions become very easy when you change the way you look at output versus outcomes. Now, I think for folks who are already a PM, you probably would have been into these shoes where you have to make a decision and you are expected to be right. Now, you cannot be right all the time, but especially as you are growing in your career, you are expected to be right a lot of times. For example, if you are a new PM, 1 year, 2 year experience, you may have or may not have someone to lean on for those decision making. But as you are senior, 5 years, 10 years of experience, you would be expected to have that sixth sense. Now, sixth sense is not just intuition. Sixth sense would be defined with a lot of data understanding you would have, a lot of market understanding you would have, and your ability to really prioritize, to say that out of A, B, C, D, E, I have to say no to 4 of them because I just don't have capacity. And I know this B problem statement is going to give us a lot of customer value and a lot of business value. And that's why we should go ahead with it. The challenge with a lot of PMs in thinking is we think doing more is doing right. That just because we are able to do 3 things, I would be able to make my manager happy or I would be able to make my customers happy. But no one likes clutter. See your behavior yourself. If you enter a room and you have 50 clothes out on the bed versus you are able to shortlist 5 of them using some rationale you would have, which one would you like? Same applies to features. The more number of features you keep pumping on your app or your website, just because there is a new capability does not mean it will drive some value to the user. So really focus on what your opportunity is to be able to identify the highest ROI opportunities, how you are able to test them, fail them fast if it was not the right choice, and really iterate on top of it. Because you probably will not get most of your decisions right the first time, but over a period of time, you'll be able to really iterate and make them better. And sometimes we are scared to not do that because failure is perceived very differently based on individual personalities. But as a PM, you also have a responsibility to cultivate the behavior where failure is acknowledged, right? It can be around 2 things. It can be about a PM making a wrong choice. It can be about a person who may have failed in life at a startup, at something else that actually makes them probably a better choice for you. So identify people who have that ability of, sense of decision making and try to replicate that in yourself as well. Now, before we move forward, I just wanted to quickly touch on what we spoke a few minutes back about first order thinking and second order thinking. Now, all that we discussed can actually be boiled down in this to a good extent. Uh, First order thinking is nothing but you making decisions based on your past experiences and beliefs. You mostly taking the decision which is very safe, which is not going into depth, and you are making decision too fast sometimes without going into details of what caused that decision, how would that decision impact other things, why are you really making that decision, how would you measure if your decision was right. A lot of these things are missing when you are thinking like a first order thinking. Now, it's not magic that you would suddenly start being a second order thinker. It's a journey in that sense. It will take a lot of times and it will take considerable behavioral changes for you to be able to train yourself to think like this, and not just as a PM. Apply this thought into your personal life and personal decision making, and you'll realize that how many decisions, let's say when you selected your college, did you really go into the details? Did you have the right facts? Did you have the right numbers about your future? Did you even had a plan in that sense? And a lot of times you may find a lot of those things are first order thinking. Second order thinking is really when you are able to look beyond what you currently believe in, or what your assumptions are, or what your biases are sometimes. And you are able to put a lot of impact uh, because you made a decision thinking about the future, thinking about the hows and whys, and how it will affect. And that's why it is hard. It takes time. It has to be really logical. You cannot get overly, I would say, biased because of your past experiences. And over a period of time, if you would look at your managers, your leaders in your company, you would be able to clearly categorize who are first order thinkers and who are second order thinkers based on decisions they make. So irrespective whether it's a PM decision or engineering decision or anything else, try to really do an exercise to identify what second order thinking is for that scenario, and don't hurry to make a decision. Wait for a few hours, wait for a day, jot these things down, identify how that decision will impact. Let's say you're making a change, it may impact your compliance team, your legal team, your platform team. uh, and a lot of times you may not think about all those downstream impacts if you're just thinking about the short term returns. So irrespective PM or not, try to identify ways to move your approach to a second order thinking, and that would tremendously help you. You would considerably start seeing differences in your ability to make decisions, and I would say it would translate very easily into your career as well, if you want to grow in your career, or you want to switch domains, or any of those. Now, we discussed about why this is behaviors or habits matter, and how can they play a role. But let's actually talk about how do you build this product sense. And it takes time, like we discussed about it. Now, again, to highlight, it is a skill. It is not something you are born with. It is not something that just because you went to a college you would have product sense. It is not any of those things. Now, irrespective of your current scenario, you are able to develop it because it's a skill. It's like, can I run a marathon today? No, because I never practiced for it. But can I run in 2 years? Probably yes, if I work hard enough to build right habits, what a marathon runner needs to have. And same applies for product sense, that it is a skill which you are able to practice in all your decision makings, not just your work decision makings, and you should be able to develop that. Now, as we get started, for all of you who are able to, pick a problem statement from these four. These four may be slightly trickier. Like, I don't know how many of you have worked in self-driving space or space travel space, or reverse aging space, or Neuralink space. But if you are able to pick one of the problem statements from these four, because they would force you to think uh, harder. If you are not aware of these four at all, and you don't feel comfortable with it, or especially if you are aspiring PM, I would recommend you to pick one of the products in the bottom, and many of them you probably would have used. So pick your Ola or Flipkart or Swiggy or Paytm, Practo, Dunzo, Nika, whichever product you like. Try to take a challenging one where you may have slightly lesser understanding. And as we go through each of the slides, apply that framework, assuming you work in one of that space. So let's say I pick self-driving cars in India, and I will build all the examples around that. You try to jot down some of the points on a piece of paper based on what you think is the right approach. And again, don't try to do too many things. Try to apply the principles of how you should logically think, which would help you make a better decision. So as we get started, I hope you have picked your example. I'll proceed with self-driving cars for India, for example. Now, the first thing in that is, how do you practice empathy? And empathy is a very broad word, right? As a PM, we need to be empathetic, but it would be unreasonable to expect you to be empathetic to your customer, but not be empathetic to people around you. So that magic would not happen. If you want to be empathetic to your customer, it's very easy to start with people who are around you, where you start paying to the words they are telling you, to the emotions you see and feel. And that is the only way, as you become a good PM, you are able to really be customer's advocate and not your manager's advocate or your CEO's advocate only. And that would set you apart. So as a PM, irrespective of the domain you choose. So for example, I chose self-driving cars. I should be able to do a mapping of saying that, hey, I met this customer, and what does this person think and feel? They think that, let's say they are differently abled and they are not able to drive a car, and having a self-driving car would tremendously help them in India. What do they see? They see a lot of chaos on roads. They are not able to drive because they cannot afford a driver at this point, and their job depends on being able to commute safely. What do they hear? How do they feel about it? What are the primary pains? What would be the gain if their problem statement is solved? All those things are areas you should be able to map for your work or your problem statement you choose. And this is a simple framework you are able to apply not just for your PM job, for anything else as well. Think of any personal decision you would have made uh, with your wife, with your husband, with your parents, with your friends. And a lot of times you would realize that being empathetic was not just a unique trait for a PM. It was a trait which you could have easily developed as a person, and you would see reflections of that personal trait into your professional world as well. So again, try applying this framework to the problem statement you chose, and going forward, try to see if you can pay attention to the words and emotions that you see around your friends and family as well, and give it a thought. That would really help you practice empathy rather than just reading about it. Next point, really important, something we touched on briefly, is your customers will not walk to you and tell you that I have this problem, can you build this for me? Think of it like if Steve Jobs was just sitting in his office thinking about designing a nice phone just because he had an idea of building a great phone. Now, sometimes we can get biased because of how we see some of the personalities on books or TV shows or movies. But you would realize when you read about them is how deeply customer centric they were. And Apple is a great example I always personally find about that. When you realize the number of people who work at Apple who are researchers who come from deep backgrounds of understanding customers, you would be astonished, because it was not an idea of just one genius to think that you should build it like this. Yes, there were multiple geniuses who were involved into doing so, but many of those had very deep understanding of what challenge users were having. Mind you, Apple was, when they were getting started, BlackBerry was tremendously successful. It was not like the BlackBerry users were unhappy, but someone was able to find the real pain points and build something which was tremendously successful 20 years, 10 years down the line. Similarly, for example, if I choose self-drive car would not work same for US or Europe or India or Indonesia or any other country, right? Every country have their own unique challenges, own unique infrastructure issues, own unique, I would say, driving behavior. And you cannot apply one lens to all of those markets. So what that means is, as you think about your problem statement, identify what customers you need to meet. Of course, you cannot go and meet right now, but just try to identify for your problem statement who your customer really is. For example, if you chose Nika, for example, is your customer, let's say, people living in tier 2, tier cities, tier 3 cities rather than tier 1, because they may have more options. If you chose Ola, who your customer is. If you chose something else, try to identify the demographics and area where your customers are, and that's how you would be able to really narrow down who you are building for. Now, as you get to know your customer, one of the things which would become tremendously important for you as a PM is, okay, you got a lot of qualitative data from your customers and you were able to define behaviors from that. But prior to that, you really need to have a habit of knowing your market. And it is hard. It is not about reading 5 articles from a website which just publishes startup news. It is much more than that. It is not about reading that one McKinsey report and it will magically train you for your industry. It is really about knowing multiple things. That what motivates your market. It can be macro and micro factors. Uh, what are the pricing strategies? Like, can you see through, let's say, incentive game some companies playing, but they are very clear that 5 years down the line, they would not have incentives. Uh, are you able to analyze your competitors, that how your competitors are progressing. You are able to track them really closely. You are able to go down and understand their business strategy, how they are thinking about building that business, how they are thinking about competing in that space, how they are going to price their product, whether they are going through a subscription model or a revenue model, or some transaction margin model, and what their customers are also thinking about it, right? Because eventually, if you're operating in that space, that understanding is not going to happen when someone launched a feature and you are suddenly asked that whether we should build it or not. It takes time, and that's what you need to identify how you are learning. So for the space you selected, try to identify who your competitors are. So for example, if I am in self-driving car, I would think, okay, maybe Tesla is my competitor. It's very heavy into Western markets right now, but they are already launching in India. Now they may have challenges in self-driving space, but probably they are already thinking about it. So let's identify how Tesla would solve it. Who else can be my competitor? It may be Waymo. That Google is very serious about building OS for self-driving cars. They are already testing a lot. Maybe they are behind Google, but then let's identify what their strengths could be, because that is a company which can sell their software to Maruti Suzuki or Hyundai or anyone else and really make it a mass market product. So you being able to identify your competitors, how they are working, where their pricing model could be, where their market standing right now is, would really help you a lot. So for the example you chose, try to just apply who your competitors are in that space and how do they operate. Like, are they revenue positive? Are they burning money right now? Why they are burning money right now? What's their end game? Like, what's their game 2 years down the line, 5 years down the line? Based on other market scenarios, you are able to understand. Look at how economy of that region or a country or that demographic is working, and all those statistics and opinions you would get to know about, all those behaviors you would learn from customers, are truly encapsulating this opinion of you to say that, hey, I know my playground, I know how to play in this game. Because without that, you would be playing the game, but it would be like playing football on streets where you may not have rules, but then it is still a game. You want to be at a ability where you really have deep understanding of some of these things. Now, moving forward, and I'll try to go slightly faster, is on how you are able to practice problem solving every day. And problem solving, again, is not just about a product manager's job. It is about, in any scenario, how do you approach it? That, are you able to comprehend the situation? Are you able to identify the customers? Are you able to report the needs? Are you able to prioritize things? Are you able to measure them after that? And a lot of those would need your ability to solve a problem, apply it to your car buying decision or a house buying decision as well, and the principles would remain the same. Now, I have given an example of a framework on the left, but the recommendation here not is to use the framework. Use any framework tool you prefer, or your company uses, but the goal is your problem solving needs to get structured, and it would help you make sure you don't leave corner cases. And that's where one of the exercise we all as PM should always do is to product market fit tear downs. uh, it can be through a community, it can be, you can do individually, you can do with friends, but really identify, let's say, Gojek, and think about how it is working in Southeast Asia market. That would force you to learn about Southeast Asia market. That would force you to learn about Gojek's business and its competitors. That would force you to think about, is there a similar model in India or in Africa or in US or in Europe? And those tear downs are really powerful. So try to build that habit of really solving problems. That, pick a industry, pick a market, and go deep into it for that week. And every week, if you are able to tackle, or every month, if you are able to tackle something or the other, you would tremendously see that how much you would end up learning at end of the year about number of areas you have. And who knows, just because you were able to learn about so many things, you may be able to find the right domain you really love, instead of just logically moving from company A to company B, or level A to level B. So build that as a habit. Product market fit tear downs are really powerful, and think beyond the obvious. Think beyond normal behavior, what you are seeing in market, and really look globally. Don't narrow yourself down to a market only. One of the last thing is analytical senses. The reason I'm touching it in last is some of those things are intuitive that you would have to do. So I'm not specifically calling these out, but irrespective your product management part or anything, you being able to measure it would help you know that did it work, did it not work, and for you to be able to, really be able to change things. So for the problem statement you chose, think about what would be the things you would measure. So for example, for my self-driving car example, my key KPIs would be the number of accidents should be less than 0.001%. It can be about I should be able to reach my destination faster than what I was, let's say, few months back, because the car was able to make better decisions about routes, about driving safely, about just making sure to remind me to charge my car or any of those actions. And similarly, define it for your area. That what would be the key data points when you are launching something, what would you really measure, which would influence whether the product is having a good product market fit or you need to iterate on that. So define your customer and business outcomes so that you are able to make your problem statement logically proceeding towards a solution. And last action in that is really being able to prioritize, right? Prioritization seems simple. Create your backlog, pick whatever has a logical highest priority and story points, and it put it into a 4x4 matrix. But it may not be as simple as that. Sometimes you may have hundreds of items in the backlog, and the goal is not to just put something in the backlog. All the points we discussed about customer empathy to deep understanding of customer to deep understanding of market and what you want to measure and what are your business goals and customer goals, they will narrow down here. Use any framework, any tool you like, but try to find opportunities which would make your product 10x. And that is where your growth would happen. Like as a PM, a lot of times you may be executing, but like I said, as you would grow to be uh, someone managing multiple products, your goal is not to make 1,000 decisions every day. Your goal would be to make a small number of high quality decisions that would really take your business from x to 10x. And similarly apply the principles to the problem statement you chose, that what would be the thing that would drastically crack the product market fit for you. Now, for my example, for self-driving car, it may be cost, it may be infrastructure, it may be about uh, just ability to charge at your home versus charge at your office, and how and all of those would play role. But then I need to identify what is that one thing which would drastically change the adoption of my product or visibility of my product. Similarly, think about what would be relevant for you or your product in those senses. Now, as we wrap up, and I'm running a few minutes late, four things you basically should take away from our discussion. You should be empathetic to customer and really be the advocate of customer. Any job you are doing, try to find out who your customer is, whether it's an end user, whether it's an internal team, whether it's some other platform team, but really identify what their problems are. Next is do a lot of market tear downs. Have really deep understanding of market, about competitors, about pricing strategy, about their finances, and that would truly help you predict their next steps. And you would realize that, hey, I made this prediction and it worked out because of these logics, not because there were 5 options and I chose one and it came to be true. Third is problem solving. Like we said, use your analytical ability, use your problem solving ability, whether a framework or not, but how do you solve and approach a problem is going to be of true essence. And that's where process really also plays a role. So try to also identify what process works for you, which helps you save time, save money, and reduce cost of operations. And last is being able to prioritize, launch, and iterate. And that is again a pure mindset play, that how you are prioritizing for scale and not for short-term success, and how you are comfortable to launch, fail, and really be able to iterate. And it is not easy. Failing and getting up, whether you are a product manager or anything else, it can be tricky. So try to find how you are able to do that better and apply some of these principles in even your non-product decisions, and you'll see that that structure may bring some more values to you. Thanks everyone for taking our time. I know we only have 10 minutes, but happy to discuss any questions or comments or suggestions you have. But if we are not able to cover your question today, feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn or reach out to me on email. Now, for those of you who were able to do that activity with all of us, send me an email or post it in the chat, and I'll definitely reach out to you uh, post the session.
Thank you, Saurabh, for delivering a brilliant session. Really great and thought-provoking insights. And as you can see the chat window, we already have some good comments saying this presentation was amazing. Right, so let's go ahead with the Q&A session now. We have a few questions already lined up for you. Let's begin with the first question by Karthik. How do you see PM incorporating AI ML in an application? If a product falls in the quadrant where some sort of products already exist in that region, in that case, how do we define MVP, and what all the parameters do we need to keep in mind for defining MVP?
Okay, so I'll take the second part first, and then we'll talk about AI/ML, because AI/ML is just a tool, if I may say. Now, the first thing is really MVP, and I think MVP can have different opinions from different people, but MVP does not mean you launch a shitty product, right? The product is still something that people can use. Like, think of, if you have seen the Facebook movie, for example, the product they launched in college was probably not as pretty as they have right now, but it had high utility. So how you think about MVP is also probably on the similar lines. It does not need to be a really bad product just because you had to put something out in the market. It has to be usable. It has to solve a customer pain point, because the first set of users you are able to acquire are probably the hardest as well, because they may not know about you, they may not have trust on you, and that's where having a strong product market fit also plays a role. So I think thinking about MVP is in the same lines. If the product is something that would delight your customer, think of it like minimum delight product. What is the minimum number of capabilities you need to delight a customer and download your product, or sign up for your product, is what your MVP should be. Now, it would always be incremental. That does not mean you wait for building so many things before launching. That probably is not the right way. The sooner you launch, the better you are able to get feedback and you are able to iterate. But really being able to define based on your segment would really help you a lot. And it would depend on how crowded the market is. Like, for example, if the market is really crowded and your product has no differentiating value, it is okay to build some other differentiating values before you say that, okay, this is a product which I'm comfortable launching. But it should be sooner. You should not wait for a very mature product and then call it an MVP. On the second point about AI and ML, again, AI and ML are tools. You may do personalization through multiple ways, but bringing modeling also brings a lot of other challenges as well. One is just the skill set, right? Not everyone may have the skill set to build the modeling. You need abundance amount of data to really leverage models, right? Like, let's say you have 5,000 customers right now. Irrespective of how great models you would apply to it, models are very dependent on the amount of data and quality of data and parsing of data you would have. So you need to make your judgment consciously that just because AI and ML are the thing of the market right now, not everything qualifies as models. The third thing is the challenges of using a model. Other than technical challenges or skill set gaps, modeling can be very sensitive towards data privacy and all other areas around user security. It is it can be really challenging to be in a scenario to use data wrong, where you did not take consent from the user, where you did not inform the user how your data would be processed, where you ended up not storing the data right, where you ended up leaking the data intentionally or unintentionally to your marketing partner or to your sales partner. So it's a very, I would say, tricky space to operate in. And if you decide to operate in AI ML space, be conscious of not just the skill sets and the need, but be really conscious about data privacy and data security, because the moment you get into one of those hassles, it may not just be a legal and compliance issue. Your customers may end up losing trust on you, and it may become harder for you. And you have seen examples in the industry that they fell into some data privacy leak, and it can take years and years for those billion-dollar corporations to really get their reputation back in that sense. So I would be cautious to evaluate whether it's truly relevant for my business. But also, as we build, really aware of how data is coming, how consent management is happening, and how you use data.
Great. So we'll move on to the next question. I hope you have a few more minutes for us, Saurabh. We'll take one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So this next question is from Rohit Nagpal about empathy maps. There may be a gap between what a customer thinks and how she acts. Similarly, there may be a gap between what a customer wants and what she needs. How do you cut through all this and get the information that you, as a PM, really want, especially when you have just started developing the product?
Yeah, and I think it's a really great question, especially because there would be opinion on both sides. There would be people who would say, "Oh, customer doesn't know what they want," or there would be people who would say that, customer would tell you what they really want. Both of those would probably not be true, and honestly, that is why the job of a PM really exists. Otherwise, you basically don't even need to have, paying salary to that job. The more you talk to customers, the more you will realize about the differences of them stating their problem statement, but the fundamentals are primarily similar, right? Uh, so the reason you do multiple customer interviews is, one, to touch on multiple demographics. Let's say you may be interviewing a female from 30 to 40 years of age, middle income, let's say under 5 lakhs per annum. You may also be interviewing a person who is earning 20 lakhs per annum and is under 30 years of age, male, living in tier 1 city. And then you cover a whole horizon of customers who are applicable to you. But what becomes important is how you distill that information to really identify, okay, there is a commonality of these problem statements in these customers, and how do you solve for that? Because sometimes you cannot build one feature for this segment, one feature for this segment, one feature for this segment. And that's where, when you approach your customer interviews, do multiple interviews, cover the demographics you need, and then distill and identify the commonality between them to really narrow down on what problem statements are there, and then prioritize them. And I think there would be some scenarios where some customers may be able to clearly say that, hey, I actually want this, but don't take it just because they said it. You should hear it. You should keep it in your backlog, I would say. But what user really asks sometimes is not exactly what they need. And that's where the big difference would happen, that your distillation process would dictate it. Listen to customer, what they are really thinking. Like sometimes you may hear customer is saying, uh, I want uh, some items to be delivered to my home. Now, okay, their thing is they do not want to go out of the home because there is COVID, but the underlying need may be something different. They may want order not to be placed on app, but on a phone. They may not want, let's say, capability, how you are thinking about it. So go deeper than what customer is really asking you to do. And I think that's where you would be able to distill. Now, of course, you may not get it right every time. So there is always that trick involved.
This is great. And Saurabh, I know you are already late for your next appointment. And in view of the time constraints, we will have to end the Q&A here, audience. Thank you so much for your participation.